You love looking at yourself. You retake a photo 10 times before posting it. You silently scream to people saying, "I live the best life." Then somewhere inside you, a voice echoes in the void. You are terrified of people seeing the real you. In this video, we are looking at a story about a guy waking up to the horror of his perfect life act. By the end of the video, you will question your own narcissistic motives. Pause the video sometimes to think, you will be more real, my friend. So, why do we care so much about looking flawless to strangers? Like, genuinely, why does it matter so much that people we have never met think we are beautiful, successful, and interesting? Think about it. We spend our money, our time, our energy creating an image for people who will scroll past it in 2 seconds. Oscar Wilde was asking the exact same question in 1890. And the answer he found is genuinely disturbing. The story starts in a painter's studio in London. His name is Basil Hallward, and he is completely obsessed with a young man named Dorian Gray. An artistic obsession, like a painter becoming obsessed with a face that seems too perfect to be real. Dorian is young, beautiful, wealthy, and completely unaware of how powerful his own appearance is. Basil has been painting him for months, and he finally finishes what he considers the greatest portrait of his career. He loves the painting so much he almost refuses to show it to anyone. But his friend is in the studio that day, Lord Henry Wotton, and Lord Henry is a completely different kind of person from Basil. While Basil looks at Dorian with pure admiration, Lord Henry sees something to play with, and the moment he meets Dorian, he starts talking. Lord Henry has a way of speaking that sounds like wisdom but is actually highly manipulative. He tells Dorian something that sounds like a compliment but functions like a curse. He says, "Youth is the greatest thing a person can possess. That beauty is a form of power." He explains that it fades, always fades, and when it is gone forever. He says the purpose of life is to feel everything, experience everything, follow every desire, because regret is the absolute worst thing of all. He calls this the philosophy of new hedonism. Basically, do whatever feels good, all the time, and never apologize for any of it. And Dorian, who has never had anyone speak to him like this before, gets completely hooked. But here is where it gets interesting. Do we truly want to live a life of flawless pleasure, or are we too cowardly to face the real pain of growing up? Because the thing Lord Henry is selling looks amazing on paper. No consequences, no guilt, no aging, no responsibilities. It is the dream life of every teenager who has ever existed. But Dorian is about to find out the actual cost of that dream, and it is terrifying. Dorian looks at his finished portrait. It looks flawless. It shows him at his most beautiful, his most young, his most alive state. And standing there looking at the painting, something breaks inside him. He thinks this painting will stay young forever. The painting will always look like this. But he, the real Dorian, will grow old. His face will change, his beauty will fade, and suddenly he makes a wish, a desperate, wild wish. He says out loud that he would give his everything, his entire soul, for the painting to age instead of him. If he could stay young and beautiful forever, while the portrait carried all the damage. And the wish comes true. He does not know it yet, but it happens. Now think about this. Why do we let manipulative friends and influencers ruin our lives with their bad ideas? Because that is exactly what is happening here. Lord Henry forced Dorian to do absolutely nothing. He whispered ideas into a young man's ear at the exact right moment, while Dorian stood in front of the mirror of his own perfection, feeling the first real fear of losing it. Lord Henry found the crack in the wall and poured his philosophy right into it, and Dorian swallowed the whole thing. This happens constantly today. You scroll your screen and some guy tells you that caring about other people is weakness. He tells you image is everything. He advises you to optimize your entire life around pleasure, status, and appearance. And, it feels wrong, but it also feels kind of exciting. And before you know it, you have spent 3 months copying someone else's lifestyle, wondering why you feel totally empty inside. Lord Henry is every bad influence that has ever entered your life, dressed up in beautiful words. So Dorian starts living this new philosophy. He throws himself into every kind of experience: parties, art, music, beautiful items, beautiful people. He is the most sought-after person in London. Everyone wants to know him, be near him, get his attention. He is young, glowing, and apparently feeling wonderful all the time. The portrait is hidden in a locked room upstairs, quietly taking on the aging and the damage that Dorian's real face refuses to show. And then he meets Sybil Vane. Sybil is an actress. She performs in a small, slightly shabby theater, and she is incredibly talented at it. Dorian falls completely in love with the girl because of her performances. She plays Juliet, she plays Portia, she portrays these great romantic heroines, and she does it with this raw, electric emotion that takes Dorian's breath away. He tells Lord Henry and Basil about her. He is going to marry her. Sybil is the most real thing he has encountered to date. But when we are truly happy, why are we always doing something wrong? Because the issue with Dorian's love for Sybil is this: he is not actually in love with her. He is in love with her performance. He is in love with the character she becomes on stage. He has barely met the real Sybil, that real young woman with feelings, fears, and needs. And when Sybil falls in love with Dorian, something happens to her acting. She goes on stage and suddenly cannot perform like she used to. Because she has experienced real love now, and the theatrical version of love feels hollow and fake to her. She stands on that stage and cannot produce the emotion she used to produce, because her reality is waiting for her in the audience. Her performance collapses completely. And Dorian, sitting in the audience watching this, feels something turn to ice inside him. After the show, he goes backstage and acts very cruel. He tells her she destroyed the most precious thing he loved about her. He breaks off the engagement, he walks away, Sybil is devastated, and a few days later, she kills herself. And Dorian feels almost nothing. That is when you realize the portrait is doing serious work. Because after that night, Dorian looks at the painting and can see it has changed. The face in the portrait has a new expression. There is something slightly cruel around the mouth. The painting records everything. Every cold choice, every selfish act, every moment Dorian uses someone and walks away, these appear in the portrait. The soul Dorian is slowly losing is listed right there on that canvas. But why do we push away those people who offer us unconditional love? Sybil loved Dorian sincerely. Not his image, not his performance, she loved him entirely. And the moment the entertainment value ended, Dorian abandoned her. Because real love requires being seen requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is the ultimate price a narcissist can never afford to pay. Consider subscribing if you are finding the video interesting. Dorian locks the portrait in a room upstairs and returns to his life. Years pass, and Dorian does not age. He stays perfectly, supernaturally young. People start noticing this and talking in those hushed London gossips. Men who knew him 20 years ago look at him and feel unsettled. The portrait in the locked room keeps getting worse. It takes on a more damaged, more deformed, more monstrous form, but nobody sees it. Dorian keeps it locked away and continues his beautiful, gilded, increasingly darkening life. He starts surrounding himself with the most expensive, most beautiful items he can find. Rare perfumes, exotic fabrics, precious stones. He collects them obsessively. And here is the question that should make you uncomfortable. Why do we surround ourselves with beautiful things when we feel completely dead inside? Because beautiful things are a distraction. They are noise. When the inside turns into something too unbearable to look at, you focus on the outside. You renovate the house. You buy better clothes. You post that aesthetic picture. You make the surface as flawless as possible so you do not have to look underneath it. Dorian is doing this on a mansion scale, but the mechanism is exactly identical to doom shopping online at midnight because you cannot face your own thoughts. And then Basil shows up. Basil has heard the rumors. He heard the things Dorian supposedly did, the people he ruined, the lives he passed through and left in pieces. And Basil, who still sincerely cares about Dorian, who painted that portrait with genuine admiration, needs to look him in the eyes and ask what is true. He comes to Dorian's house late one night and confronts him. Dorian decides to show him the portrait. He takes Basil upstairs to the locked room and shows him what the painting has become. And Basil is horrified. He can barely even look at it. The thing in the frame no longer resembles that beautiful young man he drew. It looks like something rotted from the inside, something demonic wearing a familiar face. And Basil, standing in that room, realizes everything he heard was true. He understands Dorian has turned into something he can no longer recognize or defend. He tells Dorian to pray, to ask for forgiveness, to find his way back. When people try to confront us with the truth, why is our first instinct to destroy them? Because the truth is unbearable in a completely different way when it comes from someone who actually knew you before all of this. Ignoring a stranger criticizing you is easy. But someone who loved you, saw your potential, believed in you, when that person holds the mirror up to you, things change. It touches a deeper place, and the most certain way to stop it is to stop them. Dorian kills Basil, right there, in that locked room, while the monstrous portrait watches. He kills the man who cared about him the most, the man who created the painting that started all of this, and then he blackmails another man and threatens him to dispose of the body. After this, he goes out to an opium den and stays there for a while, trying to feel absolutely nothing. Does hiding our darkest secrets make us feel safe, or does it slowly drive us insane? Because Dorian has been hiding for years at this point. Every dark thing he did went to that room with the portrait. He tells himself none of it counts if nobody knows. He tells himself he is still the same Dorian, still young, still beautiful, still the person everyone sees at parties. But the portrait knows. And somewhere beneath all that beauty, the numbness, and the expensive distractions, he knows it too. The weight of it starts to crush him. He thinks about changing. He even tells himself he will be someone different. For a moment, he convinces himself that a good deed he did for a young woman in a village means something, that it proves he can be moral. He goes to look at the portrait, hoping to see a small improvement, a tiny sign that his choice worked. The portrait looks even worse, because that good deed was a performance. It was an act of kindness done for the exact same reason Dorian did everything, for how it made him feel about himself. And the portrait knows the difference between real change and a performance. It always knew. He decides the portrait must be destroyed. He grabs the knife he used to kill Basil and goes upstairs to the locked room. He will cut the canvas, destroy the evidence, free himself from that thing that has been recording his life for all those years. If the painting is gone, maybe he can start over. Maybe he can act like he is clean without the mirror of his own corruption staring back at him. He plunges the knife into the painting. And when the servants hear a terrible scream and break down the door, they find the portrait hanging exactly as Basil painted it, completely restored to its original state of a beautiful, young man in the prime of his life. On the floor, with a knife stabbed into his heart, lies a wrinkled, very old, and grotesque man, almost unrecognizable. It takes them time to realize who he is. They identify him by his rings. That person is Dorian Gray. Every year he ran away from, every line he should have earned, every consequence he transferred to the canvas, returned to him the moment he tried to destroy the record. The portrait gave back everything it had been keeping for him, all at once, all inside that terrifying second. And if you could trap all your guilt and mistakes inside a painting, would you genuinely want to see it? That is the question Wilde leaves in your hands at the end. Because the portrait was telling the truth from the beginning. It was the most honest thing in Dorian's life. And instead of facing it, he hid it, locked it away, and allowed the painting to become more and more monstrous while he continued to display that beautiful version of himself for everyone else. The scary thing is that we all possess a version of that portrait. Maybe it is not a magical painting. Maybe it is that diary you stopped writing in, that friendship you allowed to go cold, that conversation you constantly avoid having, that detail you know about yourself but decided not to look at too closely. And every time we play that flawless version of ourselves on the internet, every time we edit the image and hide the truth, the gap between the portrait and the performance widens a bit more. Wilde is not saying beautiful things are bad. He is not saying enjoying life is wrong. He is saying that when the image becomes more important than the human, when you start making your choices based on how they look rather than what they actually are, you start losing yourself slowly. And this disappearance happens slowly, silently, behind that locked door you do not have to look at. Until you do look, that moment always comes. And when it arrives, you make a choice, facing it. Genuinely facing it, not pretending to face it, not confessing for the applause like Clarence in the bar, but actually sitting in the room with that ugly portrait and saying, yes, this is what I have transformed into, and I want to be something different. Or you can pick up the knife. Dorian picked up the knife. You do not have to,